This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
I'm Tom Hoppe, and I'm your host of the Most Painful Podcast. Well, listeners, this is the end of Season 2. Episode 10 is the last show, and it's been a great season. We've covered a lot of topics, and we're going to have Season 3 starting in September 2023. And on that season, we're going to have topics such as cannabis. We're going to do a deeper dive into cannabis. There's been some questions that have come up from the listening audience on that. And on psychedelics, that's another interest. And we're going to have Cameron Gauntz back talking about identity of athletes and how it compares to the military, and looking at a program to help veterans with transition along with athletes. So that's Season 3. Keep your eyes out for that one, and subscribe to the channel, and you'll get notice when that comes up. Over the last couple seasons, we've covered many topics related to chronic pain and the impact it has on veterans and their families. We've talked about identity, military identity and chronic pain, and how that has an impact. Now, in Canada, every military member goes through the same basic training methodology, which forms a military identity and culture. But how does our own civilian culture impact our military identity? As you know, in Canada, we have many different cultures. And when we join the military and we go through military training, how does that impact us when we become veterans? Today on the show, I'm joined by Luc Hébert, who is a veteran, a professor at Laval University, a researcher at the Quebec Rehabilitation Center, and lives in Quebec City. Luc, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, it's great having you on the show. So, Luc, you're going to be the host of the French version of the Most Painful Podcast, which I think is excellent. This will give our French audience a chance to have the same access to the excellent information that we've provided on the English version. So this is exciting news. I'm sure you're excited to be a host of the French version of the Most Painful Podcast.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward.
Well, maybe you can just quickly introduce yourself and let us know what you're planning for your show.
Sure. So my name is Luc Hébert. I am a physiotherapist, full professor at the Faculty of Medicine at the Rehabilitation Department at l'Université Laval in Quebec City. And I'm also the Director of Research for the Radiology and Nuclear Medicine Department. I'm a regular researcher at the Centre interdisciplinaire de recherche en réadaptation et intégration sociale, called the CIRIS, and a research center that is part of and attached to the Quebec Rehabilitation Center, commonly referred to for the people that know the center as the IRDPQ. So after completing my physiotherapy studies at the University of Montreal, I joined the Canadian Armed Forces, completed my officer training in Chilliwack, BC, and served 28 years in the Canadian Armed Forces as a physiotherapy officer. I was posted and deployed as a member of the military to several locations in Canada and overseas, including the position of National Physiotherapy Training Director at the end of my career for the last 14 years. And in this position, I was responsible with my team for setting the standards of care and practice for physiotherapy within the forces, the Canadian Forces Health Services Group, and also for developing a training program that finally allowed military physiotherapists to be deployed on missions, of course, notably in Bosnia and most recently in Afghanistan. I have also completed a master's degree in biomedical sciences at the University of Montreal and a PhD in experimental medicine at Laval University. And since July 2022, and I guess that's where you invited me here, Tom, I have accepted a mandate within the Center of Excellence in Chronic Pain for Canadian Veterans as Director of Research Partnerships and Chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee.
That's quite an extensive background, and I think it's quite relevant to what we're talking about on the show when it comes to chronic pain. Physiotherapy, as we know, is a big part of rehabilitation and to get people back on their feet. So when we talk about pain research, I just want to you are at Laval University. You have obviously extensive history in research. So as a researcher, just curiosity, is there any impact that French Canadian culture has on veteran health research?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Tom. I really like what you said in your introduction regarding how does our own civilian culture impact our military identity. And you're right to say that in Canada we have many different cultures, and we do not really know if that impacts us as military and or when we become veteran. But honestly, I think it would be pretentious of me to tell you that I know the answer. But here's a bit what is my perception. I think Francophones are often very emotional and they sometimes express openly what they think. And I don't think there's nothing wrong with that. But at the end of the day, it doesn't make any difference when they do their job and complete a mission. The militaries, regardless of cultures, and you know that, are all trained to focus on the task at hand. I think what you expect most of all as a military person is good leadership, whether it's in French or in English. So a veteran in Quebec is probably no different than a veteran outside of Quebec. They have had similar experiences, both positive and negative, and therefore the research needs to help treating and managing their chronic pain or any other comorbidities are the same.
Yeah, and I know when you say that it's the same, as a veteran, and I've had the opportunity of serving with many different nations, and we used to have an old, I guess, kind of jokingly say that you could meet a soldier anywhere in the world and you'd have a drinking partner for the night, because there are a lot of similarities when it comes to military training, but there is going to be some nuances with culture. So
Absolutely.
So I guess when we're talking about research when it comes to chronic pain, would you? I mean, this will lead into my next question, there, Luc. But you say the research needs to be the same across the cultures. I guess when we look at chronic pain, a body's a body in a sense. I mean, there's going to be differences in gender, and I understand that. But
Yeah, go ahead.
so when it comes to military, is it really what's the difference? Is the mindset that has to be, I guess, focused on by researchers? Is that the impact that it's going to have on chronic pain? Is military mindset?
Yeah, no, that's another good question. I think, as you know, veterans are former military personnel who have been on active duty in the CF. They have often been trained to accept working in difficult, if not extreme conditions, both physically and psychologically. They have been exposed to traumatic events in mission, and they have always put the mission before their health, which is very unique to the military population. And as you know, it's a fact, the prevalence of chronic pain in veterans is significantly higher than in the general population, about twice higher. And two other elements to consider when we talk about research with military, especially in the management of pain in veterans, it is often associated with other issues like mental health problems. And therefore, this component must be taken into account. And also, maybe their military culture, which is not well understood by the general population and the researchers. Their military culture means that the veteran does not abandon himself easily to the first clinician who comes to treat him or her. So this person must first feel that there's a bond of trust that exists.
Yeah, and I think when we look at that, the identity, and there's a lot of research, it seems to be, I mean, when I was looking at this, there's a lot of research on military identity and its military identity. And I remember talking to Jim Thompson, who has an extensive, background in this military identity, and we said mindset, and he said, I don't think it's mindset. And, well, I don't know. We kind of hummed that back and forth, and we kind of came out, yeah, well, there is a mindset that is developed when you join the forces. And I think it seems like some of the other health research I've read, and I know you and I have discussed this before, is, there's all this research in identity and culture. However, when we look at chronic pain, is that really carried over, right? Like it almost seems to me like there's a gap. And I know Melanie Knowles just finishing off hers on family and intergenerational pain. And we did see that there was some connection with, actually a lot of connection with military identity.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess it's a conversation you and I could have here openly and just kind of talk about it. Because you're on the research end of it, the medical research side, and I'm coming at it from the identity and the culture side, and not being a medical researcher. So it'd be interesting to have your thoughts on that.
Well, I think you're making a very important point here for researchers. So the question would be, what should researchers consider when conducting veteran research? Because there is indeed a culture gap, and I agree with you. Well, I think first researchers need to be better educated about the military culture. They are not. The military are committed people, completely dedicated to the task, completely devoted. They are trained to perform tasks that have no equivalent in civilian life and does succeed in a mission. And this is regardless of the conditions under which they will have to do so. And this is another thing that I think researchers need to be aware of. The military have often sacrificed everything, their health, their family, and their loved ones to accomplish what has been asked of them. So if you want to carry out research activities that will have an impact on military personnel and their families, I think researchers must first better identify what's the demographic profile of veterans, for example, in Quebec. They must better understand their needs in terms of healthcare and services. And then, based on this information, I think research should help to develop healthcare service points in different parts of the province that will make it possible to respond to these needs in a timely manner. And these words are very, very important, Tom, in a timely manner, which may not be the case right now. And this is where research, I think, can and must become a lever. Researchers need to work with veterans and their families together to understand their needs and bring their knowledge and insights to veterans to eventually enable what we're still looking for sometime, the development of effective interventions to treat their chronic pain. And I think to do this, honestly, veterans must be considered full partners in research projects. Okay, we're not there yet, but it's coming. They could be partner whether as participants, consultants, or even co-applicants. I think veteran engagement in research is essential, and it is probably the best way to ensure that research leads to results that will directly impact the quality of life and improve the health of veterans. And this is a real challenge.
Yeah, and that's really good detail on the importance of having veteran engagement. And I mean, there's, we could kind of pull that apart a little bit and talk about, I mean, I've worked with researchers as well, too, and they do a wonderful job. And when we talk about military identity, you get this, yes, I understand it, but there's even veterans that don't understand military identity. And I can use myself as an example. I mean, I've been going through this journey, I think, for the last number of years, 20 years, and every day I'm learning something new. Mm-hmm. But we look at mindset, and that's why I use this word. And I've talked about in other podcasts is I think this is where the gap, I would suggest. It's Tom's feeling. This isn't the law.
We will coach you. That's okay.
Yeah. An example I use is time. Like we know in the service that if you don't show up on time, there's a serious consequence. Mm-hmm. It could be as simple as a slap on the hand, or you could, worst case scenario, you're going to get charged and do some extras or go to jail. Well, when you take a young person and you beat that into them, that you have to be on time, and now they're a civilian, and you wonder why the person is getting antsy when they have to walk out the door, and their wife is late, and they're getting antsy, and they start acting out. Because, I would suggest they themselves don't even realize why that's happening. But when we stop and say to them, listen, it's because, you were trained that there's a consequence to this. That's the awareness, I think, that helps. How do we get that over to researchers to understand? Because that's, unless you've lived it, how do we get the researchers to say, hey, this engagement is more than just having a veteran sit on your board and tell you this, but the veteran themselves also has to be aware of their own changes to provide, I would suggest, to provide a good, unbiased approach to the researcher as well.
Well, I guess it goes by education. We need to educate the researchers about the military culture and the mindset, but we also need to educate the military about, being conscious why this happened to them. Just to give you an example, I as a researcher in the Canadian Armed Forces for almost 28 years, I was working with a young and very active military population. No problem, no physical problem, no mental issues. I had a strong interest in everything related to physical impairments and activity limitation. And of course, with a particular interest in muscle function and pain. And my studies with military personnel, I quickly observed, and I still do observe that sometime with veterans, that pain is often a trivialized symptom. And that is often what leads them to develop musculoskeletal disorders or troubles that will sometimes prevent them from pursuing their careers. And these musculoskeletal disorders could have been avoided if more attention would have been paid to pain symptoms, in their early career. But again, this is something that they have not learned to pay attention to their signs and symptoms. And when they become veterans, suddenly they realize that they do have a lot of pain and symptoms and that they cannot have an active life. So I think education is a good start.
Yeah, of course, education is key. And then I think also as well, it's awareness, right? I mean,
Awareness, yeah.
yeah, because I think it's important on both sides of the fence. We can't put it all the onus on the researcher, right? When it comes to veteran culture.
No, you're
I
right.
think we can't put it all on them either, right? And I think they have to be careful when they're choosing the veteran to. And I know some of our veteran listeners might get upset with me on this, but it for all fairness, the veteran themselves has to understand the transition they've been through in order to be, if they're going to be like a co-lead, right, patient partner.
Yeah.
And I'm just throwing this out. You're the expert, so I'm looking for your advice on this. But I would think a co-lead is much different. I guess there's maybe a higher standard required than, say, patient engagement.
No, you're right. But again, I think you're right that the veterans need to do their part. But if we're talking about research, I think the major issue is to educate the researchers, because I'll give you the example in Quebec. I mean, it may be the same in the other provinces, but veterans are an unknown population in Quebec. And they are often, unfortunately, associated with negative events in the news or the newspaper. And the typical image of a veteran in Quebec, and again, I don't know if it's the same in the other provinces, but it is an elderly person in a wheelchair with a chest full of medals and who attends the November 11 parade once a year. I think the image of a veteran in Quebec in 2023 can be someone, yes, with a lot of medals, but who is younger than 40 years old, who has been deployed in combat missions or humanitarian mission, who has developed chronic pain, and who is still an active person in the workforce, and who, despite of his or her disabilities, tries to remain active in the society. And this is something we need to, again, to clarify with the researchers if they want to do research with the veterans.
Yeah, and I think it's important because we need to get the discussion going on both sides, right? And
we have to.
Yeah, I think both in the veterans community as well as the researching. Yeah, because if we're looking at things like safe movement, for example, which is totally foreign to a military person, if the researcher doesn't understand that most basic concept, and the trust as well, we throw the trust in there.
Yeah.
How does that steer the research? How does that steer the focus group? How does that steer the questions for the focus group, right? And then at the end, what's the outcome of that? Because that all, I would suggest, as research, that all forms your hypotheses at the end when you're using those questions and everything.
Absolutely. And this is why lately we have a few examples in which we have highly qualified researchers that are used to do, for example, focus groups or surveys, and they had their questionnaires revised by a veteran. And they did realize that even though the questions were relevant, they didn't use the right words. And there are some questions that were totally missing to capture the information that was relevant to answer the research questions, because they don't really know how to approach veterans. They don't know that population. And this is something they can learn. And this is why they need to work with veteran partners in their research project. If you allow me, Tom, to put on my hat as chair of the Scientific Advisory Board for the CPCOE, I'd like to add a few words for my fellow researchers and future applicants for CPCOE funds.
And that's the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence for Veterans for people.
Correct. But this is also a message that veterans and their families should hear. So for researchers who will apply to the Center of Excellence for Chronic Pain for Canadian veterans for funding, they must first articulate how they will engage veterans in research to help address their specific culture. That's the first thing, because this is the gap often noticed in research proposals. They should also provide a short explanation of military culture, identity, and how this will, can, or could impact the project for which they are asking funding. And that's interesting because this may force, and I know it did, force some of my colleague researchers to read research on veteran identity, which could or should be the first step maybe in understanding the gap between what is done in research in chronic pain in the general population and what should be done with Canadian veterans. And I think the applicants should also decide and clearly state how they plan to work with the veteran. And you just mentioned that. Very concrete example, the number of hours of work expected, their expected role within the team workflow, and how and at what level they will pay for their services as a consultant, and so on. So they will also have to think about, and you just mentioned that, and I'm glad to have heard that, they will also have to think about what skills and knowledge are required of the veteran they are planning to engage. And of course, the Center of Excellence on Chronic Pain can help in all these areas if you contact us.
Yeah, and that could be, I think, we have to wrap up here, but I think that can go any country, any researcher who is doing research in veterans. It's going to be the same. As we started the show, that is, there is commonality among many militaries. I mean, this is why you have research from Australia, U.S., England, and Canada, combined when it comes to identity, because there's a lot of similarities.
Exactly.
So, Luc, thanks for being on the show. You're going to be the host of the French version of the Most Painful Podcast, which is going to air in about another, mid-May, I think, something like that, towards the end of May.
Yep.
And to our listeners, the English version, Season 3, is going to continue in the fall of 2023, around September. We're going to have some great topics on there. Send your suggestions in to the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence. You can reach us on Chronic Pain CPCOE on Facebook and on Instagram. You'll see that link on Spotify and all the Apple and other podcast suppliers. I'd like to thank the audience and the listeners for your support over the last year or so. The podcast has grown both in Canada, the U.S., and in Europe. So we appreciate your support. And we look forward to Season 3. So stay healthy, keep the hope alive.
The Most Painful Podcast
is produced for the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence by Story Studio Network and Eye Contact Productions.